I misspelled something on one of our show titles and said that someone was sexually ambitious as opposed to sexually ambiguous.
Nadja.
Which neither was true. I had to change the title for her because she said, Andy, that isn't quite right. We're talking to Nadjeschda Taranczewski. I got the name right. We're going to talk to her about her journey from believing that she was so-called straight and then finding a woman and realizing that she had feelings for females as well as males, and then being in a relationship for 18 years. So we're going to do that today, Bamboo-san.
Oh, wonderful.
Chaos. And
we like it
that way. So this is our second time together with Nadja.
Love it. I've spent more time with her, actually.
Yeah, you have. You were in her course.
Yeah.
And for people that are interested in that, it's a money work course that goes on. CU
Money.
CU Consciousness University.
Yeah.
So when...
But just say a little bit more.
Oh, yeah?
It's for people that want to find peace with the relationship they have with money.
Nice.
Yeah.
I had a quick conversation with Nadja about a month and a half ago.
And you tend to do that when you're booking people for the show.
Yeah. And
did you go to her?
I was introduced through Peter Koenig, I believe, because Peter said, hey, Nadja would be a great guest. And then I had a very short conversation with Nadja, and it was so funny because like within 5 minutes, I booked 2 shows with her. Like I didn't even say, let's just do the one. I was like, no, we're doing 2 shows. It was just clear. When she articulates a message, it's always very well stated and clear. And she reduces things down to the essence, which makes it just easy to understand and grasp.
Nice.
So I thought, how cool is that? Let's bring her on for 2 shows. And what was beautiful about this show is that I don't know if you like know or seen or realized, but I mean, there's so many people in my network, and I believe also in yours, of women who I've known who've considered themselves to be straight, whatever we use the word straight, had relationships with males, and then would then suddenly shift and just start having a relationship with females.
Yeah, definitely.
And what I thought was really nice, and what I've noticed, which was really quite a beautiful thing, was that I was just realizing that
Nadja's off.
Yeah, and I hope that other people can hear us. If you can't hear us, let us know, because it would be a shame if we're talking into the wind and no one can hear us. That would really, it seems like it's okay. Nadja is left for a moment. We'll see if we can get her back on.
I'll put my phone on just in case.
So the thing that I found really fascinating was that all of a sudden, these people in our lives were coming and saying, hey, all of a sudden I now have a relationship with a female partner.
Yeah.
And I thought it was humorous. One of the jokes that
I can't hear us.
Oh, no. You can't hear us either. Okay, Can you hear us, Nadja?
Hello. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, so Nadja can hear us now. Something just happened. That's very curious. So, oh, no, she says she can hear us.
But okay.
We both read it wrong, actually. Isn't that funny? Our assumption was that one would say we can't hear us. But so
continue.
Thank you. So we were just talking about Nadja. She was gone, so we'll say everything we talked about her while she was away. But basically, what I've seen happen a lot is that there has been this freedom to explore sexuality and not be confined by social norm. And I've seen it happen a lot. And what I laugh at is that I'm going to say the 4 friends that I now have that are closer to me that have had the traditional, whatever relationship that would be, male, female, have shifted to having a female relationship. Like the humor was the way that I would trigger them was say that they were a lesbian, right? Because immediately
I've seen you do that.
Yeah, I've done it. And the humor was that it's this weird not seeing I'm not a lesbian because I don't identify as a lesbian. I actually just find that I'm attracted to this individual and they happen to be female. But that doesn't mean that I'm not also attracted to males. So this labeling has been really interesting. And even the show title, when I, how it works with me, I do 20 shows in a day. So there are mistakes. And Nadia has some German blood in her. So when I make a mistake, Nadia is one of the few guests that'll come back and say, Andy, you got to fix that one. So when I did this, I started out and I called the show Sexually Ambiguous, not because she was sexually ambiguous, but I was like, what's the title that may be interesting? She's like, no. And I realized only afterwards is that she's not sexually ambiguous. The world perceives somebody who isn't making decisions that they think are traditionally normal as ambiguous. Yeah. And that was the humor. I looked at it from the other perspective where she was like, well, it could be perceived that I'm sexually ambiguous where I'm not, right? That was the humor that I got out of the title change. So she came up with the name Not So Straight, which I just loved anyways, which is really great. So yeah, that's basically it. And I thought it was really cool. And she was very free to talk about it, where some people might be anxious. And I thought, how cool is that to spend an hour on this? Yeah. And yeah. I don't know if I have any more. She's back online, so we can go to her as well if there's anything you have to.
No, it's good. No. Let's bring her on.
Hello.
Hey.
Oh, we don't have your audio now.
Oh, she's muted. One second. I can't unmute you. You have to do it yourself.
Okay. You have to unmute yourself. We've got you. Right? Hallelujah.
It's a wonderful chaos.
Thank you. And yeah, exactly. Wonderful chaos, because I just disappeared, not because I got triggered by any strange titles for the show, but rather because my computer just suddenly crashed. So if that should happen again, I hope not, but don't take it personally. It has nothing to do with you. It's all me.
Yeah. Nice. Great. Well, we will talk about it as if we know what we're talking about. So that's fine.
Great. What could go wrong? Nothing.
So thank you for coming on a second time.
Thank you for having me.
Was anything that Andy was sharing out of line, or could you resonate with what he was saying?
Well, most of that I didn't hear, but but I like the explanation, Andy, you had for the original title that you chose, the Sexually Ambiguous, because I realized I had read it in a different way, and when you just explained how you were thinking about it, made complete sense, right? And actually, as I was thinking about what title I would prefer, which was then how I came up with the Not So Straight, I also thought about sexually ambidextrous, which would be probably more appropriate.
Yeah, actually would be.
So but that made a lot of sense, and I do think you're right. There's a lot of pressure that I also experienced from my external world once I fell in love with Olga, to sort of take my space, sort of to make myself identifiable as something, right? Everybody wanted a box, including actually me. And that was something really quite challenging to deal with, especially my own wish to have a box.
Wow. That's curious. I have a niece who's had gender, I don't want to call it issues, but hasn't known how to gender identify in a way that made her comfortable, and society would make sense of it. So she, at some point, wouldn't identify as anything. She went by the they, them, I guess, would be the pronouns that she was using. We can get into that as well, because I saw you use that on your LinkedIn. But she went to the they, them. But then she said, I'm frustrated with society's need to be conformist. So she said, I'm a lesbian for those years, just to make it easier, because she didn't want to deal with the nonsense.
Yeah, I can totally relate to her. And I must say that, at least in some countries in the world, I'm very aware that this is an utterly privileged position that I'm in here in Germany, that these kind of conversations, or across Europe, I would say, can happen in a fairly safe way, here in Berlin for sure, and Amsterdam as well. And then there are other spaces in Europe where that might still be a lot more touchy. But I do think it's true that there is a discomfort for the ambiguity of labels. And for me personally, that was actually one of the most shocking things to find out about myself, is when I because up until that point, up until I fell in love with Olga, I always thought, I'm a very open person, right? I consider myself to be, a liberal, if not, really left-leaning. I did have gay friends. So as far as I was concerned, I thought everybody can do whatever the heck they want. What makes you happy, what floats your boat. Until, something that I didn't expect to be part of my narrative made me happy or caught my attention. And then suddenly I was really thrown into a crisis because I couldn't find my box anymore. And I had no idea how important my box was to my sense of self. So the not being able, because for some women, and I've heard that numerous times, is they've been in straight relationships, for a long time, for, maybe 20 years. And then suddenly they fall in love with a woman, and it's nearly as if sort of the angels are singing, and they suddenly realize everything until this point was, either a lie or, just it wasn't the best way possible for me. Yeah. And I didn't have that, frankly. What I had is I felt so attracted to this particular person that was a she, and I did not know what to do with that. I did not feel any wish or need in me to identify as a lesbian. And to this point, I really don't. But what to do without that box, because nobody knew where to put me and I didn't know where to put myself.
Did at that time when you had met Olga, did she identify as being a lesbian, or was she also? Okay.
No. For Olga, she always says she was one of those baby dykes who fell in love with Princess Leia of Star Wars when she was 5. So it was, nice. It was already very clear. And but to be honest, even for her, it was sort of difficult to handle me falling in love with her and vice versa, because she had made a pact with herself, or had learned, I guess, to not be attracted to straight women, because it always reliably had led to heartache in her life, as it does for many gay people. Yeah. So, for her it was hugely confusing to be attracted to me, because she couldn't figure out why that was happening to her, because she never fell in love with straight people. So
and that's what I was going to ask you, because we also have one of, I mentioned in the preamble that we have a few friends, and one of the friends who fell in love with somebody who's really designated themselves as lesbian has trouble in the relationship because she is scared that she's always going to need to have a male sexual partner at some point. So it's like, if you don't dedicate to being a lesbian, then I'm never going to have your full attention. And that's created tension in that relationship to begin with.
Yeah, I would say that's true for a lot of relationships that started this way, where one partner was not declared a homosexual, or did not identify as homosexual. And we had those conversations as well, because it's kind of that question of, I mean, in any relationship, there is this insecurity. What happens if you meet another person, right? Nobody has a guarantee that we'll stay in love forever. But somehow in the beginning, at least, of our relationship, it felt as if that risk was magnified by Olga having, for me, the wrong gender, right? And we really had to work quite hard to figure out what are the rules of our game. And that was one of the most fascinating, difficult, and rewarding processes that I've ever been through, because Olga really challenged me to be honest to a degree that I've never been honest in any of my straight relationships, because we had to negotiate everything, right? There weren't any preconceived sort of game plans of how this relationship could work. And it was only through that relationship and our negotiation process of what does it mean to be, at least bi in a gay committed relationship, that I realized, I think at the end of the day, that is true for any relationship. But somehow when you're in a straight relationship, you have this idea that you know how things work, which is of course not true. Right. And it's not, it's really unhelpful, because we all have to figure out as couples, how do we make this relationship work? And that might be very different from a previous relationship, etc. So, but that brought up, how should I put this? Some very interesting conversations.
Did you, because you've been with her, as we spoke, from the start, 18 and a half years, which is a long time. From the point which you met her, did you at that point establish that? Did you ever experiment in that time with having relationship with men, only to sort of like test that out and figure out how can you have a relationship with Olga and allow yourself to feel this other energy that's inside you? Or were you able to, I don't know what I call, wean yourself off of the penis very fast?
No, we actually did come to an agreement where that was part of our particular configuration, where I was basically allowed to have sexual relationships with men if and when I felt that was needed.
Yeah.
Now the interesting thing is, so I realized, and that was a long battle, right? That wasn't how we started, because it was very threatening and very painful for her to be in a position where she had to consider something like this, because also by nature, I would say Olga is an incredibly monogamous person. Like when she commits to somebody, she's just committed, and that has nothing to do with her being gay. It's just who she is. And I'm by nature a more polyamorous person. I've always been that way. It doesn't matter if I'm with men or women, right? So that was another level of complexity that we had to negotiate and navigate. Once we had figured out this arrangement or this commitment to each other, the need for me to experiment with that decreased immediately, right? So it's sort of this, this very stereotypical, when you're not allowed to do something, it's so much more attractive, right?
I wanted to say that exactly what you're saying is so fascinating, because as soon as it's not forbidden, all of a sudden it's like, this isn't needed anymore. It's the forbidden part of it which makes it so problematic.
Yeah, so the forbidden part was definitely, it was sort of the grass is always greener on the other side, the forbidden fruit, all of those principles. Once I had that agreement, though, there was a degree of becoming really considerate about if and when I use this, because I realized everything has consequences, right? So even if I'm allowed to do something, it doesn't mean that it leaves no trace.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I've talked to friends about this who have lived in open relationships for 20, 30 years. And, some of them gay, some of them straight. I think it takes an incredibly advanced level of processing and dialogue in a relationship in order to handle that. And what I realized at some point, the price that I was paying, even though I was allowed to, was high. Right. And the longer Olga and I went on, the more I thought, is it really worth it? Yeah. Like, is any dick that great, if I may say?
Exactly.
Put it that way.
Yeah. But I mean, the beauty is, and this is why I asked it, because, and by the way, I have to say I'm a little bit prejudiced because I have the reference to this other relationship that I've actually tangentially been involved in, where the woman had sexual needs in the polyamorous world that she couldn't resolve in the straight female relation. And quite interestingly, it evolved very much like I hear you describing it. Like she needed the space to sort of make peace with herself in order to come back to the relationship and say, okay, this is how I can see it working.
Yeah. So so in terms of the learnings that I've taken away from all of these years now with Olga, the first one was to realize I actually have a part in me that was very conservative and very concerned about my choice to be in this relationship, and very distraught about the lack of a box, right? And that was something, I mean, in terms of just self-awareness, that was sort of mind-blowing and rather unflattering for my self-image, I must say. So I can talk a bit more about how that got resolved. And the second piece was really this insight about every relationship has to have the courage to negotiate its own boundaries and its own rules of the game. And it doesn't matter. And that's why I use my background now also in the work that I do with couples, straight couples or gay couples, doesn't matter. Because I basically say, just imagine there are no rules. What are the rules that you will set up because they work for you, and for what reason, right? And how many of those might be grounded in assumptions about how a relationship should be, right? Versus what you actually need. Yeah. So those are two huge things for me. And I use them in my work now all the time.
Yeah, I think in everything, society has a lot of roles that we have to play.
I have a question.
I'm happy.
Just from the point of your last relationship with a man and until you met Olga, like I'm kind of having in my mind the story that possibly you kind of got tired of men or something, and somehow that experience might have made you open to something completely different.
Oh,
Is anything I'm saying true here or resonates to some degree?
can I rephrase the question in my own words? I would love to ask you, was it a desire to get away from men, or was it an attraction to a woman, or was it a mix of both?
For me, it was very clearly an attraction to this specific person, right? So I don't think there was anything in men in general that was off-putting. Although interestingly, now that I've been in a gay relationship for 18 years, right? People sometimes ask me, if you and Olga were to break up, what would happen, right? So I think there's still, a fairly high chance that I might end up with a man. However, I think I have upgraded my pick of men so much by having been in this relationship, because there's certain things that I just wouldn't do anymore. And I would say my relationships with men, and actually that links back to the last session the three of us did around collective trauma, right? Based on my particular family history and the trauma in my family and the coping patterns that people had developed in my family around, for example, especially alcohol consumption, had led to my pick in men, unfortunately, often including men that had issues with drinking, right? So that's not obviously an issue that men in general have. It was just my particular patterning in the partners that I would pick. That's something that I think I have fully healed by now. So I would definitely not go for anyone with sort of slightly alcoholic or, drug dependencies, any of these tendencies. It's not serving me today anymore. But that doesn't have anything to do with gay or straight.
Yeah.
So for me, it was just really that Olga on many levels is, at our wedding, I joked that I had always asked to find my soulmate. And then I said I should have been more specific. Because I did, right? I mean, I did find my soulmate. She just came in a radically different packaging than what I had envisioned. I was still waiting for the prince on the white horse, and then she came along. I was like, no, I didn't order you. She's like, that soulmate. So,
it's like the genie. You make a wish in the bottle, and then you get the wish, but it didn't turn out like you expected.
Exactly. Yeah.
18 and a half years ago, the world wasn't so gay compatible. In fact, we didn't have LGBTQ, FG, everything. Like, there was no lingo. You're either gay or straight. And I don't even think lesbian was almost labeled in gay as well. I mean, it was sort of, if you're gay, that's just the word. At that time, I assume that there would have been even more struggle than there would be now, where now it's just kind of considered a little bit more just, this is normal, that people have a gender identity and a sexual preference, and that's just how we live. So how was it then, 18 and a half years ago, compared to what you imagine it would be like now if you were to do the same?
So I agree with you. I think the rules of the game, or what is deemed to be acceptable, have really changed, right? I feel what is lovely about this generation growing up now is that they have such a more relaxed understanding of the fluidity of things, right? So in terms of the, being ambidextrous or ambiguous or whatever you want to call it, there's just less judgment about it, because they realize, well, there's people and I can be attracted to people, and there's probably, in my book, there's a spectrum anyway, right? I think there's very few people who are clearly on one end of the spectrum and on the other end of the spectrum. I do think they exist, right? So for example, Olga is one of them. She just always fell in love with women, and that's it. But I think for most of us, there's actually a range. And if there wasn't so much sociological, societal restriction around it, many of us would be much more open to explore. And I do believe in some circles that is now beginning to happen. Pockets, right? Berlin, Amsterdam, there are pockets of that.
Yeah.
When I fell in love with Olga, that wasn't so much the case, but I have to say that I got extremely lucky, because I do come from a very liberal, left-leaning background. So in my family, I didn't have any pushback to that. People were very surprised. I think nobody was expecting that. It came completely out of the left field for them. Everybody was like, "What? You really?" But beyond that, I didn't ever experience any of the sort of overtly prejudice or hostility that some of my friends sadly had to experience. So for me, it was easy, but I do recognize that for many people, this is still to this day an incredibly hard journey.
But was it a case that you said to them, I'm a lesbian, I'm gay, or I happen to be attracted to a woman?
No, I was even more specific. I said I fell in love with Olga and we're now a couple. So that was the end of our discussion, right? So, and people were like, oh, okay, right? So, so there was never too much of a conversation around that actually in my life. And that was easy. For me, it was more the internal negotiation, right? So for example, when I came out, for the lack of a better word, at least came out in respect to my relationship with Olga, and I was looking through the Gay City magazine that we here have in Berlin, and I was looking at all the depictions of gay women. I was like, that's not me. Like I had, I felt so far removed from that, and all of that made me feel uncomfortable. I just felt not represented. And the first time actually that I was curious and pleased or flattered with this new identity of mine in the media was when the show The L Word came out. I don't know if that was something that any of your friends watched. There was a show with Jennifer Beals, who was one of the lesbians on the show, that took place in LA and was all circled around her group of sort of mainly lipstick lesbians who were very successful and their lives. And it was really sexy, and it was really different from all the depictions of gay women that I had seen in the media here. And suddenly I was like, oh, okay, I can identify with that.
You're a lipstick lesbian.
Well, probably more than
I love seeing your face like that.
You forgot sexy.
Yeah, you are sexy as well, of course.
Well, thank you. But my point here is that I think what is really important is representation. Yeah. Right. So we need to have role models of people that we feel we can relate to in order to become more clear about who is it that I am.
I think it was interesting because as you speak, when I last year, I don't know, years are blurred now with COVID. Last year, I believe it was last year.
Probably last week, but
exactly. Anyway. I flew to New York for the Glisten Awards, right? I don't know if you know the gay lesbian. I don't know what the SEN means now, but it's basically awareness and education and support of kids in schools, in grade school and high school and so on. And what I found fascinating, and what I only learned when I was there, is that a big part of acceptance of the current sort of status quo of what's acceptable is what's on TV, what's on sitcoms. And I've seen that in general, the first wave of what was acceptable in sitcoms was white gay men.
Yeah. But even for them, I think that's amazing that happened. And it was a very stereotypical depiction of what you're supposed to be like as a gay man, right?
Yeah.
So what I find is increasing now, and that is really helping, is sort of to see gay people are not just one thing, right? As a lesbian, you don't have the shaved head and the what do you call that?
The jacket. Exactly. And the boots.
Right? And you don't ride a motorcycle, not necessarily.
Yeah.
There are some that look like that and that do that, but there's all shades of gay, right? And to have that be depicted on television, I think is incredibly influential in shaping consciousness, awareness, and also tolerance. Yeah. So, the other day, Olga and I were watching Star Trek Discovery, which is, I think, just an amazing show. And saw a gay kiss in there, right? So two of the men in the show were kissing, who were a couple. And it was just so fantastic to see that, because neither one of them is sort of your stereotypical gay man. And And to have more of that in the media, I find is incredibly important to make kids, young people, well, anybody really feel that they're okay. Whatever shade they come in, we're okay.
Yeah. And that was kind of the point I was getting at, by the way, was that the transition happened to the stereotype gay male to then the stereotype gay female to we have roles that are just like any other individual that everyone can identify with. Because then I believe, speaking to your point, you get compassion because you can feel the pain of the character and you don't separate from them and make them a caricature and then laugh or whatever you're mimicking or whatever the thing is that they need to represent them as.
Yeah. Absolutely. And and another thing is, by doing that, by having the media sort of expand the way they portray gay people, or any minority, really. If it's gay people or people of color, I think representation is so key, because what it also does, it influences your internal narrative. Because one of the things that happened, I would say probably in year 3 of my relationship with Olga, and we were still in our struggling phase, right? Where basically on a daily basis, I was questioning, can I stay in this relationship because I'm not actually gay, or I don't know what I am, but this doesn't fully feel right. And I was just in utter confusion, and that percolated every day. And then I had a turning point when I went to a voice dialogue session with a colleague of mine. So I went to a coaching session with a practitioner who is trained in a specific modality that is all looking at different parts of yourself, and always looking at different parts as a polarity, right? So let's say you have an inner achiever, then the balance to that is sort of your inner couch potato, and how do you learn to love and see both of their qualities, but how do you then also balance them in everyday life? Yeah. So the topic of that particular session was, not my inner achiever, but it was our relationship. And what we chose to do was to have Olga be a witness to my process. And that was truly something that shifted a lot in me, because what happened during that session was that the facilitator started to ask about the different voices or positions in me that I could hear in respect to this relationship. And in the first part she facilitated, and when you facilitate a voice dialogue session, you make the client leave the chair, find a new position in the room so that they can fully step and embody that particular perspective. Yeah. Right. So the first perspective that she drew out was my homophobic part that I had repressed, because I did, as far as I was concerned, I was not a homophobic person. But this part was really judgmental about my choice to have gone into a gay relationship, the judgment was just awful. Like when this part of me was talking, everything was in there, from disgusting to horrible to, this will ruin your life. I mean, it was, that whole universe. And of course, it was still me talking, right? So with a part of me, I was witnessing myself saying all of these pretty horrific things about my relationship with Olga. And I was going, oh my God, how will I ever recover from that? Because Olga was sitting there listening. And then 2 things happened. The first one was that the facilitator then asked this part of me, what is your positive intention for Nadia? And what this part of me said was, well, Nadia has always felt like an outsider. So I don't understand why she's choosing to be in a gay relationship that puts her outside of the norms of society, when in her case, she could actually make a different choice. She could just be with a man. So why does she willingly do that to herself? So I thought, okay, that's interesting. So there was a protective element about this that I could honor, right? And then when the facilitator brought me back and I sat again on my chair, sort of just having, witnessed or having had allowed to that part to fully speak its perspective, I looked at Olga and was sort of ready for her to walk out on me, frankly, after that show. And she said, listen, do you think there is any gay person in the world who doesn't have that voice? Wow. I have that voice. Everybody has that voice, because in many ways, that's the voice of society. We've all been socialized to be homophobic. So I'm not afraid of this voice, The
Can we
question
slow this
is,
down a second? Just because what you said now is so, like, that voice. Of course, I've heard that voice spoken by others 100 times over.
yeah,
And it's interesting. I'm just feeling into, on a societal level, there's an undercurrent of shame that's embedded in it without anyone ever acknowledging that that exists, but it exists. Like the fact that one has to even justify anything, even speak about gender identity, sexual preference, even the fact that that has to be, or in some ways is insisted upon, even when you go to an airport and sign whatever it is you identify as. I mean, it's imposed on you from a very young age. So not to conform is inviting all of the stuff that you've now spoken to just now.
yes,
Wow.
yes, very true.
Hmm.
So, you know, what it brought us to in that particular conversation was that Olga then said, again, very familiar to me, I have it, everybody I know has it, it's fine. Question is, what are you going to do with that? Right? Because she said, if you let this voice run our relationship, we're in trouble because she can't be with me. If you can hear this voice without letting her run our relationship, then we can be together because I'm okay with her. I'm not afraid of her, right? I'm not afraid of this perspective. But also don't pretend like it's not there because it is part of us. And the more we try to suppress it, because also, you know, we like to see ourselves as liberal, open-minded people, it makes it worse.
Oh.
Right? Because it will come out at moments when least expected in very vicious ways. So I'd rather know who I'm dealing with when, you know, suddenly you say something that I find offensive or hurtful, than you pretending you don't have that part. So that was the first insight. And then the next thing was to find the opposite of that. And that was actually really joyful because the next part the facilitator facilitated was a part of me that felt much younger in her energy, you know, something around, I don't know, maybe 16, teenager. And she felt me having fallen in love with Olga was the first exciting thing I'd ever done in my life, right?
Yeah.
And she was like, yes, you know, finally you try to not always be the good girl that conforms to what people expect of you. And you know, nobody ever made you feel so alive as Olga. So I want this. This is amazing. You know, let's do it. And then I was left with both of these halves in me, right? And trying to figure out, ooh, how do I balance that? Yeah. But to get this acceptance for my homophobic part, especially from Olga, was pivotal for me. And I had, up until that point, I had no idea that gay people have this voice. It just, I mean, it makes perfect sense now, but I just hadn't thought of it.
I remember once I was at the airport. My best friend is gay, and we spend time together, and I feel close. I always say if I was gay, then we'd be a couple. But one time he arrived at the airport, and I took him by the arm, like as you would a loving relationship, and then I had this moment where fear came over me, where I was like, "Wow, I didn't realize I could be attacked for this." Like it was like the moment when you're so loving and so open and so accepting, and then when you let it in, you realize, oh wow, by doing that, I invite the prejudices and the vitriol of any human that is not accepting of that.
Yeah.
And I don't think when people say I don't have a problem with homosexuality or whatever they say they don't have a problem with, they never put themselves in the position of the vulnerability it takes knowing that you have a privilege and not having a problem because you're not going to be attacked verbally or otherwise.
Yeah. Actually, I think that's a really important observation because that was also my experience. That, of course, in my heterosexual relationships, I never thought twice about kissing my boyfriend in public or, you know, holding hands or sitting on his lap or, you know, whatever things you might do as a couple in love. And with Olga, I was suddenly starting to monitor that all the time and sort of scanning my environment and feeling in the first probably 6 years incredibly exposed, probably also to the degree that wasn't really true, because part of that was my own internal exposure, because I don't, now I think people are usually too busy to look at other stuff. But still, every once in a while I will notice that if we go down a street hand in hand, we'll catch somebody's eye and attention, and then they look at us, either sort of surprised or approvingly, or sometimes also hostile. And that was just something I never had to deal with before. And I think for women, it's in most places even a little bit easier, because it's, they could be holding hands for different reasons. Whereas I have a lot of compassion now for my gay male friends who have to have this internal negotiation all the time, because for them, it is a very threatening position to be in many, many places.
I have a wholly different area that I'm curious to discuss, but before I go in there, I don't know if there's any follow-ups you had in this area.
And Vamos, can I just say, I appreciate how you dressed today. You would be so perfect in a gay nightclub in this outfit. I mean,
Why do you think I came like this?
It looks great. Yeah, I appreciate the the gesture. I know my gay friends would go, ooh.
Yeah, I can tell you already. All the gay friends I have that meet him are insisting Bambos is gay. Like, there's no one who's not told me that he's gay.
Yeah, exactly. It's the wishful thinking element.
I can see why they would say that.
I have this interesting. You mentioned paradox. I always work, think, or process my life often in paradox. Where am I being pulled, and what's the counter to that pull? And when I've looked in the last years, and I'm looking also, we don't tend to bring politics in, but in this case, I'd like to also introduce the idea of conservatism and liberalism. And my story has been, and I only learned this story later, I didn't have this story at the time, was that in the Obama era of America, there was a liberalism that was being embraced that half of that country wasn't yet ready to accept, meaning gender roles, bathrooms that were designated not male, female, like all of the things that, say, middle America said, this is way too far. And what I saw or feel as my story again is that led to a Trump presidency, because the reaction to this, what people saw as way too left, way too liberal, was now we need to bring conservative values back into America again. So the one thing I'm always struggling with in myself is I'm looking not at good and bad. I'm just seeing a process unfold where sometimes the liberal development, meaning we now have gender identity, which never really existed before on the level which it has today, which now triggers the hell out of a conservative population. And now you say it's a great thing. Gender identity, having this fixed, having no roles, having everyone being able to say, and then all of a sudden, then the whole thing, the argument goes from a conservative, well, then you can have sex with cows. If you can have sex with anything and nominate or anything, like, so they take it to an extreme argument, which is so nonsensical that yet that's the way that they are triggered so strongly. So my question to you is, how do you see that balance? Like, how do you see the balance to becoming more loving and accepting of these things, knowing that massive portions of a society aren't ready and capable of embracing that? So how do you see that unfolding?
Well, I mean, that's obviously a very, very big and an important question. I don't know if I have a perfect answer to that, but you called it paradoxes. I think I previously called it polarities. What I see at the moment is that you have a society in general, but very strongly in US right now, where the polarity is on two ends of the political spectrum, right? So you have the conservatives who vote Republican, and then you have the more liberal thinkers who vote Democratic. And they've become each other's nemesis. And try to fight the polarity by fighting the opposing party. What I think part of the healing process would need to be is to discover, as a liberal, my inner Republican, if you want, and as a Republican to discover my inner liberal. So I have to take the fight from the outside into the inside. And, much as I discovered my inner homophobe, to go, oh, interesting, here you are, right? Because the more I can make peace with that part, the less I have to project it on somebody else and fight it in them. So it's an inner peacemaking process. And I actually think it's especially important work for all of us who feel we're liberal people, because we are condemning anything conservative or reaction that we perceive to be reactionary so much in other people. And it's that process that they call the othering, right? We're doing that too. We're making them the other. And in order to have a meaningful conversation or dialogue with them, I need to find the part of me that is homophobic. I need to find the part of me that is racist. And honest to God, there is no liberal person on the planet who isn't also racist, because that's how we were raised, right? And I can only imagine how relaxing it might be for example, for the Black community, if as a liberal white person, we wouldn't start every conversation with assuring them how we're not racist, but rather to say, you know what, I'm a racist. So where do we go from here? Educate me. Yeah. Because we're so defensive about not wanting to be like those evil Republicans or those evil conservative people, that we're completely missing the point, and we're making this struggle so much harder for any of the minority communities out there.
I remember telling Bambos on one of the shows when we had this topic come up, and I said I'm a racist in order to make clear the point you were making. I thought, oh my God, this is so scary to say, because if people aren't wanting to understand what it is you're actually saying, is that I'm embracing the fact that I'm open to looking inside of myself, they can twist it and use it in ways against you. So there's a degree of vulnerability that's required that is hard when you have an opposing side that's trying to destroy you so that they can maintain their own identity.
Yeah. But that is, I think, sort of the step that we need to have the courage to take. And somebody has to start that conversation, because I'm actually pretty sure that if I sit in front of a conservative person who is opposed to, let's say, gay marriage, and instead of telling them how wrong they are and how backwards their views are, I would tell them the story about my inner homophobe, there's probably a bigger chance of a door to a deeper conversation there than if I make them feel all wrong and narrow-minded and backwards, right? Yeah. So the question is, and so in a way, I feel, if I see myself as a person who is, whatever, more evolved because I invest in inner work, then that's part of my job, is to see these parts in me, to talk about them openly, and to build bridges for people who haven't thought about themselves in that way.
Yeah, very much what our idea is in this show, by the way.
Yeah.
By being open to all the subjects so that people can have an opportunity to reflect on things they otherwise might not have thought about.
Yeah. Actually, I'd be fascinated to ask Bambos a question, because Bambos, Andy said all of his gay friends are always like, oh, he is clearly gay, right? Which is also a very gay narrative about the wishful thinking that every attractive man has to be gay, because that's just how it should be. I mean, it's kind of it's funny, but I think that happens very much. What is your reaction to that? What does it create in you when people approach you from that perspective?
Oh, when it happened just now, I had a memory when I was 18. A friend of mine said he was attracted to me. And I was a drug addict back then. So I said, you know what? I'd rather be gay than being a classic Cypriot man who, in those times, I would always see him getting beaten up. So it did get to the point where we were both on the bed. We started touching, but I completely, I can't do this with you. And he said to me, it's okay. Can I touch your ass? But there was a beauty in that connection. And until this day, we are friends. But growing up and seeing him getting beaten up reminded me of my own bullying.
Yeah. So what that tells me, though, is that your degree of openness there is already way ahead of the curve in a way, right? Because most very straight men that I know, would have an anger fit if anybody would try to touch their ass, right? Or they wouldn't even be as open to say, well, let's see what happens. Well, we can explore it, and if it works, it works, and if I don't want to do it, I don't want to do it, right?
Mhm.
So,
And there was a trust. There was definitely a trust between us, and I think I've always been very physical, like hugging people, men and women. So for him, it was like, oh, does he like me? So we explored that, and apparently it didn't work out in that direction.
So for you today, is it more a compliment when gay men find you attractive, or do you find it irritating?
No, it's definitely a compliment. And Andy jokes a lot that his gay friends think that I'm gay, and I'm like, yeah, I can imagine. I'm very comfortable with my masculine and feminine.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Well, wouldn't that be a wonderful world where everybody, when somebody else finds them hot, would just say, "Ooh, thank you."
More choice.
Yeah.
When I was 16, I was working at a selling suits, and I was the only straight kid there. So it was just me with all the gay guys. And we were very friendly. So we'd go to the gay bars together after work. They'd get me in somehow, And I remember once when I was there, like someone like pinched my butt. And I was like, what the fuck? Like forgetting that I'm in a gay bar, right? And then it hit me. Oh, I'm here. This is, it was like this weird moment of, oh, this is what this is. If you're here, then not that you can't say no to that, but don't be surprised if it happens.
Yeah.
It was an interesting moment.
Yeah, of course, also about context, right? And what we expose ourselves to. But, again, to your question earlier, I do think that's also something that's lovely to see it changing. So in the Berlin club scene, I feel that the boundaries have become very, very fluid. Like if it's not so much going to a gay night anymore, but I would say to sex positive, has become a big thing here. Where, if you're game, you're game, right? And you can try anything. And it's very clear that the rules are if somebody says no, no is no. And then you move on, right? So I think if we could develop that sense of fluidity and openness, while at the same time making consent a central element of that conversation, and just really accepting where people's individual boundaries are. That would be a kind of society that I would like to live in.
Wouldn't we all?
Yeah.
But, again, I feel in order to get there, we need to stop pretending as liberal people who like to see themselves as open-minded, that we don't have these tendencies in us as well, because that's toxic.
Yep, it is.
Yeah, just getting to a point in our lives where we start to own our dark side, and I put that in quotes. Not that. Yeah.
I think, and I don't know if you've seen the work. You haven't read The Wounded Healer. Have you tracked any of that whole development at all?
I've tracked some of the development. I haven't yet read it, but yes.
the and it's fucking great sort of hashtag. Have you seen that development? Yeah, to some degree, I use just the moniker radical self-love, but I felt very much that speaking to if I can embrace the thing I resist most, then that no longer defines me in the world. That whole saying, what I resist persists. So when I hear you speaking, the things that came up on the wall, I was often finding great joy in, because people were embracing things that were even shameful to state outside. And I hear like even myself writing, I am a homophobe and it's fucking great. Like that's the whole freedom exists in the not needing to be defined by the thing I'm scared of being.
Yes. Right. And then I can formulate the opposite of that as well, and sort of dance with the two polarities, right? So if I'm a homophobe and that's fantastic, or that's fucking great, and on the other hand, I'm incredibly open, liberal, and people around me can do whatever they want, and that's true as well, right? So I can be both, and to to hold that stretch of possibility in myself. That's what I think is maturity ultimately, and freedom.
Yeah, and I think I would wish that people could come to that not intellectual understanding of it, but the embodiment feeling of it at earlier ages. Because when you feel it in yourself, then it's almost like a constant meditation. Like I sense myself being drawn to or away from energy, and therefore it's easier to regulate. And what I've seen, unfortunately, in society is it goes into the head, and then people talk about it. And in talking about it, they'll often alienate the other because there's no trying to understand one another. There's just, which gets me to another topic I'd love to discuss with you, because I see that I'm often not excited about the pronoun usage.
Mm-hmm.
And not like I care. I mean, whatever the pronoun is, but it's the way the pronoun usage is brought forward often becomes you're an asshole if you don't use pronouns the way we tell you to use pronouns. Instead of the energy of, oh, this is why we're using the pronouns to help us feel more comfortable and help people recognize things that are important to us. So the way I've been experienced, there's no vulnerability, very little, at least in the people I've been interacting with, when they're using or insisting on the use of pronouns. There's not an invitation to join. There's been an imposition that you're a misogynist or whatever the words are that people want to label if you don't. So I think it speaks to I'd love two questions. It's two questions. One is, first of all, I'm sure some people listening won't even understand why and what the use of pronouns, why it's so important. I'm not even sure if you have that clear, but I assume that you do because you use them. So I'm assuming you use them for a reason in LinkedIn, for instance. And how do you see that would become more mainstream acceptable, or how do you see that people would better understand why that's so important for people today?
So firstly, to your observation, how you find it's somehow presented in a non-vulnerable or even hostile way when you're not sort of willing to play along, if you want, or respect that or honor that. In a sense, I would say tapping into your own compassion with sort of that community and realizing vulnerability is their middle name, right? Everything about their existence is vulnerable all the time, and they have to explain themselves all the time. They have to defend themselves all the time. They have to protect themselves all the time. So one of the spaces where they can feel identity and feel they have self-efficacy and can sort of be self-authoring is by indicating to the outside world how they want to be approached. So for me, identifying as she, her, as sort of in brackets after my name on LinkedIn, is less because I feel that anybody would mislabel me, because they most likely wouldn't, but more a sign of solidarity to say, well, listen, if that's important to a very vulnerable and marginalized community, it doesn't hurt me. So I gladly indicate my support for this need or this want by putting myself alongside of you. For me personally, it doesn't really happen to me. I don't get attacked in that way, but I do recognize that a lot of people have and are and continue to be.
Wow, that's beautifully put. Why she, her, and not just she?
I think that's just no, I don't know the English word for that. Usually that's how they set it up, is they, them, she, her, him, he, him. I'm pretty sure that there's a sort of a correct. Okay. There's probably a reasoning behind that, but to be completely honest, I don't know.
No, it's always confused me, because I'm always like, isn't it just she, and implicit in she is her? So I couldn't understand why there was a necessity to label two, to have the two. Yeah.
Nice. I'm sure there is more science behind it than I can present.
Yeah, understood. Yeah. I think you answered both questions in that for me, actually.
Yeah. And I think that's the other piece is sort of to your point about moving towards being more observant about what triggers me, right? So for example, if somebody insists on the pronouns of she, her, or they, them, or whatever it might be, and it triggers me to get curious about that and go to what is the judgment I'm having about that person, right? Are they excluding me? Are they shaming me because I don't understand this? Are they, sticklers about stupid words that don't mean anything? And to look at that for myself, right? And then the other piece is I sometimes feel that, especially for men, there's a fascinating TED Talk by a transgender woman who was born as a man. And she basically talks about realizing only once she identified also visually for others as a woman, how much privilege she had experienced in her life just because she had always been a white male. And she was like, I had no fucking idea. Right. So suddenly people weren't talking to me anymore. Suddenly people were asking me to get coffee for them, even though I still have the same PhD in front of my name as I always did. But life changed radically. Yeah. So in a way, I think there's something about this conversation where we can all do with a lot more compassion with the people in front of us that come from a marginalized group.
Yeah.
And I know, for example, within let's say that the entire feminist movement, white women now often have this tendency to want to put the entire experience of being a woman into the same box because it suits them. So to say, we are all women, so therefore we experience all the same degree of prejudice. It makes me feel more comfortable than acknowledging that, yes, intersectionality, I have some shared experience with all women because we're women, and there's some prejudice against women. But honestly, I have no idea what it must be like to be a Black woman or a woman of, any other shade of skin color, because the amount of prejudice that they experience on a daily basis, that's a whole different ballgame, right? So in a way, to move away again from my tendency to not want to feel uncomfortable, therefore want me to be equal to their experience, and I take away something really important for them, which is the fact that their lives have been a lot more shit than mine, even though we have overlap. Right. So there's something, and I think for men, that's true with men of color, with men of different sexual orientations. Yeah. There's just, really walk in somebody else's shoes for a mile, and, then you can be the judge of that.
Yeah, when they're really aggressive and nasty, I notice that I have compassion. I just don't have patience. Yeah. That's been my experience in life at the moment, at least. Meaning I can understand what drives someone to be that way. It's just I noticed it's for me. It's my own. Yeah.
And fair enough, Andy. I think we also have the right, to be impatient bastards sometimes. Like it's just a fact of life, and to always want to be understanding and compassionate with every human being in every situation is just utterly unrealistic. So.
Yeah, I think one could be. I think in some ways my journey is also to be compassionate to myself at the moment. Is like I've been so tolerant and so open and so loving, and I'm like, oh, where's the Andy that just wants to be loved and seen and actually say I love you, whoever you are. You don't need to identify as anything. I'm going to love you regardless. That feeling. And yet I am white, male, privileged, having things that they don't know. They don't see me. If they don't know me, they don't know anything more of me than he comes from an authoritative position. And therefore I'm in the category already of whatever it is they've associated with negative, which I've often seen happen. Yeah.
Yeah. It can happen. And I know that for us as white people, that is very uncomfortable, especially when we identify as a friend. Right. But I think it's hugely important for these marginalized communities to have allies that are willing to go where it's uncomfortable for us. Right? Because if we then spend all of our time explaining to them how we're not misogynist, how we're not racist, how we're not transphobic or whatever it might be, it just creates so much more grief for them, and they have to deal with that all the time anyway. And if we can just, give in a little and say, yeah, you know what? You're probably right. So tell me more. How you know, how can I be a good ally to you? What can I do? Yeah. And at the same time, and that's something that I'm sort of challenged with, to also discover the part in me that stops being compassionate at times, because that's, you know, it's partly my job description. And for example, when I look at a lot of the right-wing movements that we've had, what Olga always says is, you know, for years, the narrative has been, oh, we need to meet people where they are, right? And we need to have compassion with all of their fears and their right-wing perspectives, and we need to talk a little more. And she basically said, you know what, I'm done with this shit. Like, we need to draw a line in the sand and say, fascism is where it stops, right? And I don't care about your perspective anymore. And I can also see that perspective as a valuable perspective.
You know what? I actually would like to have our next talk on that subject, because I find that subject intensely interesting and uncomfortable for me.
Yeah.
Because the question is, where does tolerance stop and where does it become enabling? And I think that line is like, on which side are you going to allow? Because at some point, when you now take a stance and say, no, this isn't acceptable, you put yourself in a position which is uncomfortable, and yet it's standing for something. Because if you don't take that stand, all of a sudden you're one of the people when the Nazis came in and said, hey, it's not that bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, this is where I think A Wonderful Chaos is just such a beautiful title, because that's exactly what life is, right? We constantly have to negotiate these boundaries. We constantly have to assess, because there is no right or wrong, you know, in period. So where is their line for me? Where does the buck stop? Where do I say this is something you cannot cross? Where does my empathy stop, and where does it start? Right. So this constant flow of all these different energies and voices in me is, you know, being a human being is exhausting, honestly.
Yeah. We have Bolalang, who I'm sure you know from our last show. He is in South Africa. He beautifully took the chapter that I wrote about a gay friend of mine who hid the fact that he was in love with me and only told me many years later. And he published that in his South African group, who isn't necessarily all that open to homosexuality. So he took a risk in doing that. It was really quite one of the beautiful moments for me in the book, where someone posted something in an area that wasn't really going to serve him potentially, but he looks for right in things. He doesn't care what the repercussions are. He actually writes, I once had an opportunity to be proposed to by a man, a stranger. It took me to an uncomfortable place I've never been to before.
Yeah.
That's nice.
You know, and how amazing if that can happen and you go, ooh, well, thank you so much. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
I still got it. Ronnie Paputli from Amsterdam asked,
his wife.
She knows they've met. What TED Talk was that? It sounded like a very interesting TED Talk, where basically the individual had life experience from both the male and the female perspective. It reminds me.
I will dig it out for you. Okay.
It reminds me of one of my favorite Saturday Night Live episodes I told you about on the last show, where Eddie Murphy painted himself white and he went into America as a white male. And then the joke was that white males, they don't have to pay for the bus. Everything is given to them for free. And then he only discovered that because he put on the white face makeup. It was one of these very just making light of the absurdity of the color divide in America. We've gone way over time, as always. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much for having this very interesting conversation with me. And anytime again.
Yeah, thank you. It's really great having you. Our sound engineer, who edits all our shows for people listening. Every show not every show, but the shows we do, there's 30 of them. They get edited meticulously. So all the things I say that sound bad, and if I say or and, that gets taken out. And that gets put into a very clean podcast, which is available for download anywhere but podcasts, including your last podcast. And he told me that he really loved your last podcast. He said that he always enjoys it when he feels like listening to someone who knows what they're talking about. So in that sense,
Nice.
That was a big compliment from him. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, podcast guy.
Yeah.
All right, you guys. Take care. Have a lovely evening. Bye.
Bye. Hey. Yeah, Bambos. That was a nice chat. We always know Nadia. We could probably do like 20 different episodes of Nadia. Just pick topics that she can talk about because she has the capacity to talk about a lot of stuff well.
It would be good to bring her on also on money.
Oh, yeah. Did we have one on money or
Well,
not?
we had Peter Koenig, right?
Oh, of course we had Peter. That's the source, you know. If we're going to do that, we kind of have to keep Peter as the source. That show got viewed a lot, actually. YouTube, I think that's one of our highest viewed shows for people who...
The Illusion of Money, guys.
The Illusion of Money. That show is also, I believe, a podcast. We'll have to see. We've got few more shows, Bambos.
Tomorrow.
2 more. We got 2 plus 1. We got 3 more shows before we go on hiatus.
Yeah.
2 months on hiatus.
You make it like you say it like we're going to go on holiday or something.
We are going on holiday, Bambos. No, we will. We did 150 shows since COVID started.
149.
150. Why? Because we had 5 shows. We had 2 5 shows. We've done 151 actually.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Because we did some shows on the weekend when the guests were really, they couldn't do it any other time. So we have tomorrow. I've never spoken with my 31-year-old daughter, Daniel Levine, I believe. I'll have to see his name, but he wrote a book called Mosaics, which did quite well from what I could see. And we're going to discuss with him how it was to have a daughter with a disability where she couldn't speak, and how he lived to communicate with her in ways that weren't spoken, which I think is really fascinating. And I think in some ways that's how we communicate a lot in life, but we don't actually realize that.
Yeah.
Unspoken. And I don't belong here with Yuka, a Japanese woman who knew at a very early age she didn't belong in Japan. And we're going to discuss, usually, we haven't had, she'll be our first Japanese invitee on, I guess, right?
Yeah, we've had white people who lived or have lived.
Yeah, exactly.
Or have been to Japan. And Friday we have our show.
Friday, it's the best of show. We are going to think about the shows that meant the most to us, that triggered us, that taught us the most lessons. And we're going to discuss those 5 or 10 apiece.
Nice.
And we're just going to say what it is. And hopefully we'll even show the clips. I want to be prepared well enough that we could say, this is the clip from that time, and just show the clips and then talk about them.
Great. And where are we going to do that, Andy?
with a little bit less enthusiasm, Bambos. Just a little bit less.
1 second. Give me a second. And we're going to do that on
Wonderful Chaos.